Hello, I'm Kai Rosga, and welcome to Version Up, one lawyer's journey to digitally transform his legal practice. Hi, thanks for listening. Today's guest is Kevin Keller. Kevin has done it all, from product counsel to general counsel, developer to inventor, from advisor to investor, and he's done it through the formative years of the internet era. The secret to his success? I doubt it can be summed up in one sentence, but one thing that stood out to me is how Kevin has continually invested in himself by developing the skills that position him to take advantage of opportunities as they arise. I think both aspiring and practicing lawyers can learn something valuable from Kevin's story, so I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to Version Up.
Very nice to meet you, sir.
Thank you. Really excited to talk to you. I wanted to get started by exploring your background, which I have to tell you is fascinating and not the typical LinkedIn bio that I look through before one of these interviews.
Yeah. Through a very circuitous path, I am the first in my family to go to college, let alone law school. In high school, I remember getting fascinated, even junior high, with computers. Like a lot of people of my age, Commodore 64 and Atari were part of my childhood. And the first time I programmed was on a Commodore 64. But I never thought that it would be part of what I did. I grew up in a small town. My grandfather worked in a sawmill. My dad worked in a sawmill. I worked there during summers, during high school. And so it was when my friends started applying to college, I was like, wait a second, maybe I should go to college. And that was all that went into the decision. I went to college. I started like not knowing what I was doing, not the best grades, not the worst. But by the time I graduated, I was getting very high grades in mathematics and all this other stuff. And so I thought, well, if that pattern holds, if I go to law school, then I need to be really careful because it costs a lot. So I made an economic decision that I would only go to law school if I scored high enough on the LSAT that my GPA would get me into a top school that would guarantee that even if I was in the middle of the class, which I planned I would probably be, I'd be able to find a role. As I got into law school, I had this vision of like litigation because that's all you see on TV. And then I got there, I realized there are all these things you could do with it. And I started taking more business classes. I started because I was fascinated by technology, and I found myself in the middle of the dot-com boom, thinking, oh man, I love technology, but now I'm in this profession, like no one wants to talk to law students. So we figured out a way to start an incubator, essentially. A friend from Columbia Law, with Columbia Law and business students, and it's still going today, but it gave us a way to like engage with technology companies and VCs. And that was sort of my kickoff. And I had summered in New York City at a law firm, Brobeck, that doesn't exist. And because it was such a huge, like everything was happening in Silicon Valley, I said, well, I had to consider going there. So I interviewed with a bunch of Silicon Valley firms and ended up at Wilson Sonsini just in the height of the dot-com. And, I was able to just be involved in some amazing, different types of deals and technologies. It just was, but a lot of it, if you look, I think a lot of people look at the resume or they look at the LinkedIn and they see these big names and all this stuff I've done. So I had this flow of like things coming by me. And then, that was when Microsoft came my way. And that was when Amazon came my way. As a recruiter who I'd helped in the past, was like, well, let me talk to Kevin first, see if he has somebody he knows, or maybe he's interested at this time. And so a lot of those opportunities came just because I put myself in a place where I was part of that flow of recruiters passing things along. So that's how I got where I am, and bounced around from a bunch of different tech companies and everything.
I think there's a lot in there
There's a lot to unpack there, probably.
Well, I think for junior lawyers, or maybe people who are thinking about going to law school, there's a lot in there about the practical aspects of that decision.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a stereotype that people float into law school out of undergrad, but there are a lot of people who don't, and who are making a really difficult decision where they have to weigh the pluses and minuses, the money aspect, et cetera. And I would love to hear your take on what AI means for that new cohort of students, churned law students, churned
Yeah.
something when they graduate. What does that landscape look like over the next couple of years? Do you have any advice that you would give to people who are at that crossroad and thinking about what to do?
When you come out of law school, I'd never seen a contract. First time someone asked me to put together a contract, it was my mentor. And I think he'd asked me to help with a website development agreement. And I had no idea what a contract looked like. That was a time when there was a little bit of time for you to like do that or do some diligence and see a lot of contracts and everything. I think it's becoming harder for junior people to get access to that bunch of knowledge you cram in your head early in your career. And so I think what I'd say to folks, is that while you're in law school, it's an amazing opportunity that you don't realize as you're going through school how much free time you really have and how much time you can devote to learning. And yeah, probably because you're surrounded by learning, you're having to take tests, you're cramming things in, but you have this time to actually go and get additional skills. And so I always, even going through college and law school, I always looked at where are the gaps in what I know and what are the things that I don't have in my skill set. Though I purposely, when I went to law school, didn't take intellectual property courses. And I would say at this point, I am an intellectual property expert. I've done some very complex patent cross licenses. I was responsible for the patent cross license between Amazon and Microsoft way back. So very sophisticated, very high level, but I didn't take IP classes because I knew the gap in my education was business and accounting and a few other things like that. So that's what I try to do is fill in those gaps. And I'd say if you're in school right now, lean into using these tools like AI, go out and learn what it is to draft a contract. Go ask a attorney, if you're interested in that, ask an attorney for a couple samples and play with them with AI and see what you can do. Watch what people are building and engage with it right now because it'll give you an opportunity to get ahead of that curve. So when you come out of law school, you have some practical skills, or at least an understanding of the practical skills that we apply. Because I do think that will be a barrier for a lot of people coming out because there aren't as many training opportunities. There aren't as many opportunities to throw people who are fresh out of law school at a diligence project that takes 3 months in Providence, Rhode Island, which was what, the first one I was on. So that's the advice I think I'd give.
Holistic take on law school, sort of what I would think of as more soft skills, like
Oh,
take on
yeah.
extracurricular activities that give you practical skills,
Yeah.
externships, networking. I like that point as well.
Yeah.
The power of building those relationships and maintaining them after you leave law school.
Oh, you
Those are
can't
all,
even, I mean, you probably know this as well. Like the connections, regardless of what law school you go to, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, they're going to be people from your class and they're going to be your clients. You're going to be their clients. They're going to be all over in business. I have people I went to law school who are now VPs or above executive vice presidents at entertainment companies. One is a CEO of a biotech company. You can pretty much name any industry and somebody from my law school, my class who I keep in contact with is probably doing that thing. And it's not necessarily you're like trying to leverage that network in some, very transactional way, but it gives you visibility into a lot of other things. I have people I can reach out to if I have a question in almost any other area. And so those soft skills, and it's something they don't teach you a lot in law school. I really wish they had like management courses for law school students because we all end up at some point managing people and we don't get any skills. And I think lawyers are known in law firms and everything for the bad behavior of managers and the poor way that we treat each other. I think that a lot of that could be remedied by having some more of those soft skills taught to people in law school. Yeah.
I agree. Let me pull on another thread from that opening remark, which is the dot-com boom, which of course was followed by a bust.
Yeah.
How do you compare that to the present day AI boom? And how is it similar? How is it different? What lessons learned do you have from the previous experience earlier in your career that you apply now?
Yeah. I think one of the primary things I would say is that does lead me to my belief about luck, because had I came out of law school a year, 2 years later, the landscape would have been completely different. No one was hiring, we were going through layoffs and all this. And so getting that foot in the door would have been really hard. I think I was a second or third year when all that was going down. We went through waves of layoffs. No law firm had really had those before and it was poorly managed. But one of the the poorest parts of it, I think, was that if you were in law school, you'd done a summer associate deal, with one of these law firms, some of them started saying, reaching back to you while you're studying for the bar and saying, if you don't pass the bar, you don't come and work for us. Whereas when I graduated, I had someone in my class who very intelligent, had a PhD in physics from Stanford and then a law degree from Stanford. He failed the bar the first time. And they said, that's fine. We'll pay for you to take it a second time. And if there are people who failed it a second time and they said, well, we won't pay for it and give you paid time off to do it a third time, but go ahead and do it a third time and you still have a job. I saw people who I had, who had been summer associates who were great people who had their offers rescinded because they failed the bar. And that's something that can happen to almost, anyone. It's not an easy thing. You could have an off day. I felt incredibly lucky that I passed, that they could read my handwriting when you had to handwrite it back in the day. So that really informed, a little bit of my view on luck. The other thing about it was that there was just so much work happening that it was a great opportunity. And I think this is probably true for junior associates and mid-level associates at law firms right now. There was so much work that a lot of the stuff that in a slower time might go to senior associates and partners came to us because you were the only one there. So, and even as we were going into the dot-com bust and companies were going belly up, there still was a lot of work, other kinds of work. And so there was in some ways, like when that work dried up, like clients couldn't pay a lot. So then associates were doing it. So I got to do a lot of very high level work at a very junior level where I was dealing directly with CEOs, CTOs and everything. So that was difficult to deal with, but it meant very high quality work. The things that I got to do early on were coming up with somebody had a new business model. No one ever seen this business model because no one had ever done business on the internet before. You've got to figure out how to take what they're thinking of a business model and build new SaaS agreements or whatever the case was for it. So a lot of creativity went into that period of time. So if you're in a time like now where there's just tons and tons of things going on and things are changing and there are new types of businesses and everything, it's really an opportunity to really become an expert. One of the first people, boots on the ground, who gets to do this stuff and really gain some skills that are unique. So I think that's the positive of going through a time like this is that no one else is an expert. No one's been doing this for 5-10 years. I mean, AI has been around for 15. I've been advising, or 15, 20 more. I've been advising on AI and machine learning for a long time, but this generative stuff is relatively new to most people. And it gives you an opportunity to really jump in and become a world expert at a relatively junior in your career stage.
Yeah, I think opportunity is almost always there. You have to be nimble and open. You can't just go on cruise control.
Yeah.
You can go on cruise control, but you expose yourself a little bit, in my view.
Yeah. I think
If there is a downturn or if there is some unpredictability in the market, and I imagine it'll be the same with AI and this tech revolution we're going through.
I think more so now than in the past too. I mean, it was true then, but I think it's even more true now. You have to take responsibility for your own career and you have to be proactive. I had a daughter relatively early in my career. I was at the end of my first year and I really wanted to spend time with her. And it was, we're swamped and busy and it was really hard and I knew she went to bed. We put her down around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And so I wanted to get home in time to do dinner, take her for a walk, take her off my wife's hands, but spend time with her, which meant I shifted my schedule early. And at Wilson and at the day, the new client sheets, it wasn't email or anything. People are just getting used to that. They'd send a sheet of new clients around and you go into your inbox and there would be every day a sheet of who the new clients were. And if you got there early and, you were proactive, you could, okay, I want this one and I wanted this. And so you'd reach out to the partner and say, hey, I've got a little bit of time. I'd be happy to help you with this client. And I knew all the technology clients. I knew what was kind of hot or interesting. And so that's how I picked up, clients like Napster, which fascinating stuff to work on. The copyright law there wasn't established yet. And it was Wild West. And, so that kind of stuff, you have to kind of proactively say, I'm going to go out and try to find the work that interests me and not wait for it to come to me.
It's solid advice. If we think about career development in the AI world that we're living in now, where do these tools that we're hearing about that help layman people like myself try to develop basic programs. Where do they fit into this? I'm thinking of Claude Code and now
Yeah.
co-work. Is that now a part of people's career development, or am I reading too much into it?
I've suggested in a couple past few days to folks that I think by the end of 2026, and certainly by the end of 2027, I don't think you can be sort of an elite, top of the game product counsel, for example, if you don't know how to use those tools. If you haven't played with them, if part of a lot of my career has been very, very close to teams developing kind of cutting edge projects or products. And a big piece of being able to advise well on those is understanding how they work, because the data flows, what you're collecting, where you're collecting it, how it functions, what it does to your device. What kind of risks does it carry? Really, you have to be close to that to understand how to advise your clients on, there might be a new regulation, that's impacting it, that you have to be in the weeds of how this stuff really works to see if it impacts it. So I think, the rest of the world is moving on to using these tools and everything. And the best way to get that knowledge is to be using them firsthand yourself. And, certainly it's a little daunting. I think just start to play with it. And if you're uncomfortable with it, there are groups of people out there, that are engaging with it, that are more than happy to show you, walk you through what they do, give you that first step. Now with AI, you can actually ask it, how do I do this in Apple Developer? And it will help you, walk you through it and walk you through the steps. So that can be the first place. It's pretty safe. Just ask, Claude, how would I go about doing this? And then start trying it. And it sounds daunting, but I think it's getting very, very approachable for people.
I heard two themes there. One was about knowing the market and industry your clients operate in and just knowing their
Yep.
products, right? It's
Yeah.
hard to be an advisor to your clients without knowing what they do.
Yeah.
But the other part of it was deploying solutions maybe in your own legal practice to
Yeah.
help you get the right answer, get it efficiently, et cetera. Is that
Yeah.
a good summation? Are you thinking of
Yeah.
it both ways?
I think so. I mean, there's also a part to the first one, which is, not just knowing the markets that your folks, your products operate in, but knowing, how they're built and, and how they work, because that really does play into the agreements you need to do, the regulations you need to be aware of, all of the things you need to do to advise them as they're building and launching and bringing those products back from the world when they end of life for physical products. So you really need to get close to the actual products themselves. But on the coding side for internal teams, I think doing it gets you some understanding of what, it's a lot of times attorneys will be like, well, you need to change this box on the, the user flow. Well, when you're building them yourself, you realize like how much of pain that is. You got this thing working, it's all nice, and then you don't want to pull any threads that make it break. Once you're programming yourself, once you're playing with it, it does color how you give advice. I know this is a hard lift. This is what you have to do this. It also, like, your engineering and business teams that you're asking these things of, they know that you understand, what you're asking them and the weight of it, and that you've factored that into, is this really necessary? A lot of times the advice you give as a product counsel can be like, do I really need to do this? And then you spend a lot of time, well, here's the legal reason why and all this. But if you can offset that and say, well, yes, from a legal reason, and I understand it's a challenge, it's going to take this time, but here's how it saves us, for both time as well as legal issues down the road, then it helps. It helps with giving that advice, which may be hard because it is asking them to do some extra work to be compliant with something for legal.
I had gotten too focused in thinking about these tools as being something that lawyers would use to maybe automate some of their work and, be able to get through their day quicker. But you flagged a whole separate part of this I hadn't thought about, which is that as lawyers, we always are striving to be more than just people who answer legal questions. We want to add value in a strategic sense. We want to provide practical business counseling. And that
Yeah.
always brings you closer to the business side of things. And so
Yes.
to the extent that being a lawyer advisor to a business has you straddling those two sides, it does seem like a really powerful thing to know the basics of how apps and programs and software is developed if you are advising clients on
Yeah.
commercial contracts
Yeah.
or partnerships they might be considering or whatnot.
Yeah. And the closer you are to the business, I mean, I think if you're an outside counsel, a lot of times your advice is here's what the law says, and it can end there, but it's not as valuable to somebody as saying, and here's what I recommend you do, not just because the legal bill, because I've factored in all these other business factors that weigh into this. And in-house, it's even more important to recognize those and to provide holistic advice. When you're providing purely business advice, I mean, I think there's a judgment call there that you have to make. Is this purely business or is this law? Because you don't want to insist that something is legal advice that they have to comply with in some way if it's not. Across a lot of experience, you bring a lot of experience in seeing how these things play out from a business perspective. And so you may say, we don't have to do this, but there's these impacts from a business perspective if we don't do this that you might not be thinking of and that I've seen play out. And so that can be really valuable. So I'm advising we do this even though we don't have to from a legal perspective. Or sometimes it's like, yeah, there's a compliance obligation here, but if you didn't comply, what's the worst that could happen, right? But that's a very business, analysis that goes into that, into it's a combination business and legal, advice as to like, there's this regulation, but if you violate it, no one gets pinged for it. If we're doing it, then we're over indexing compared to the market and we'll be spending more resources than we need to. And if it does happen that we get in trouble for it, the impact is relatively minor. So I think we probably just do it. Right. But that's like very blended legal and business advice. And you have to be close to the business and products to be able to understand and give that kind of advice. But it's also the high quality, high value advice. The reason partners at law firms get paid what they do is not because they've been doing, an NDA for 20 years and they're the best at NDAs. There's a certain point at which there's no incremental value to more time working on them. You're not learning anything. You're not more sophisticated than anyone else beyond a certain point. But knowing that like, if I get an NDA as a startup from Microsoft, and I'm using them as an example, not as a punching bag, but this is true of other big companies too. I'm a startup. I've got a make or break deal, Microsoft deal, and they send me an NDA and I send it to my attorney and they redline the heck out of it. I send it back to Microsoft and it goes in the ninth circle of hell. And when does it come out? I don't know. The deal may be dead. So someone who has the more sophisticated view of this, gives the high level advice, just sign the thing. There's nothing that is going to kill your business faster than not getting the deal. And if down the road, Microsoft steals your confidential information, but you've got a foothold and you're a successful business, then, maybe you can mitigate that in some other ways. So that blended advice, that higher level of like thinking about it holistically, that's what's worth more. And you get that by being close to the business and seeing how things play out.
I'll confess that when I was in law firm practice, I was told many times, in a mentor context or presentation with my partners about the need to approach your clients in exactly this way. But I'd say a lot of the work I was watching didn't really match that, reflect that,
Yeah.
that desire. I think
It's
just
very
because of the
hard
nature of the
because
business of law firm and
yeah,
what,
it's very hard because then does someone come back and say, you told me to do this. And so this is one of those sort of tacit knowledge sort of things that if you're lucky, you have a mentor and you've watched how they've done this and they don't caveat things to the nth, degree in a way that's like annoying, which it can be if we're like, but here's all the caveats and all this. It's like, yeah, you're trying to cover your ass. I understand that. There's a very subtle way to like lay out that this is business advice, legally you should do this, but the real risk is X. From a business perspective, and I'm putting on my business cap and telling you this, there are ways to signal that like give you less queasiness in your stomach and providing, that gray area advice. But that gray area advice is the highest value advice. No one knows what to do here. You're reading the tea leaves and you're reading the tea leaves based upon all the business and legal judgment that you've accumulated over the time. That's hard to do. And it's hard to feel comfortable doing. And a lot of attorneys, outside counsel, especially, but even inside counsel are very nervous going outside of the lane. And they say, well, this is a liability cap. And if we don't have a cap, this, it's like, well, okay, but what's the practical implication of that? And can you give practical advice in that context and advise something that might be slightly risky, but probably is the right business choice? It's hard.
it's not something that really clicked for me until I went in-house to be honest with you. I think that being closer to the business certainly is a big part of it. Also, the fact that lawyers don't get the easy questions, right? We don't hire expensive outside counsel for easy questions. I hire them for the
Yeah.
hard ones, for the gray area stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of like a bias there where, okay, you're asking the big law partner to go out on a limb and make a strong expression of preference or try to provide counseling on sort of the business side.
Yeah.
But it's a complex question. It's a complex issue. Whereas day to day as an in-house lawyer, you get more comfortable doing that because you're constantly getting sort of easier asks in between the more difficult
Yeah.
ones.
And I think you also learn how to communicate with each other about those sort of things. I'd say, look, I get, here's the line, here's the law, here's this. How have you seen this play out? Which is another way of asking, what's the business context I should take into consideration in ultimately, as a GC, I'm ultimately the one advising the CEO, and I'm gathering either from my own experience that I can kind of gauge and make decisions. But a lot of times there's a area of law that I'm not an expert in, and I have a sense of kind of high level where it should go. And I need to ask a very precise question of somebody outside, and they'll give me the precise legal answer. And then I'll kind of push for where those boundaries are and where the gray areas are and what they've seen from a business context. And that's what I use to then formulate kind of, here's the black letter to the CEO, here's the leeway. And it's a fine art of communicating back and forth and gathering that information so you can form a somewhat informed opinion and have a confidence level that you have as to whether or not the advice you're giving is, you can really put your name, really strongly on, or you have to even then caveat, like, this is kind of risky for us, and here's how it's risky, and here's what I think I would do, and here's what I advise we do. But, you may come in a little more conservative in this for your own reasons. And ultimately it's a business judgment that is at the CEO level. But I'm not trying to I think the hard thing for attorneys is that by completely absolving yourself, you're foisting a decision on somebody who may not have as much information as you. And that can feel, if whoever gets that, whether it's a junior person talking to me and saying, here's the facts, here's the law, boom. I'm like, well, you just asked me to make the decision. You haven't given me a recommendation. I don't think you've really put the work in to understand the situation enough that you have an opinion. I want your opinion. That's why you're here. So you need to come up with a recommendation and an opinion. And then I can gauge how much I trust that, how much I need to add my own caveats to it.
That makes perfect sense. And so you've been in law firm practice, you're general counsel now, you've been product counsel. Am I right that you've also been in sort of a angel investor and strategic advisor as well? Or have you always been focused on legal practice?
I did the incubator in law school. We started an incubator, the person from Columbia and myself. And so I always sort of had a very interested in business and all this. And I started in angel investing maybe 10, 12 years ago. I'd wanted to, but I mean, it's there's some money I got to peel off from other things and figure out. And then you're placing little bets here and there on different companies. And I think at first when you start to it, especially if you're more junior, it's not like in an advisory capacity typically, but the further along you go and the more you're engaging with companies and all that, then some of them will ask you for your advice and you maybe come on as a advisor for some stocks. So I've got a few of those where I'm advising companies. And then I have a wide variety of different types of angel investments that I'm in, from space industry to company that makes protein equivalent of egg whites as a replacement for having to raise chickens in cages. I mean, it's across a wide variety of things. And I couldn't probably give you a thesis as to what I see in a particular thing and why it's, why I invest in it. But I've done a bunch of that over the past 10, 12 years, advised some companies as well. Yeah.
In your current role as general counsel, what role does technology play? Is it in the background? Is it in the forefront? How do you think about technology in your practice day to day?
Yeah. I mean, I can probably give you a breakdown just today. We talked to a legal tech vendor who were onboarding for their product. And so talked a little bit about integrations and talked about workflows. and all of that. So there's some of my day is that. I don't think today I've actually jumped into Claude Code or whatever, but I got the okay from our CTO and our VP of engineering to get my team access to Claude Code because I find it really super powerful. Good example the other day, got a lot of things to do, not a lot of time, and to create a really good contract playbook takes a lot of time. And a lot of it's like administrative. I've got to take this clause, put it in the spreadsheet. Now I got to go get our version. I got to type in opposite party and explanations for the business team. It's a lot. So I'm like, let me drop in a sample contract playbook. Let me drop in the agreement that it's based on, and then drop in our agreement, tell Claude Code. And there's nothing confidential or anything. None of our, I could even take our names out, but it's not super confidential. It's not really privileged. That work product told Claude Code, I want a playbook based on our agreement. And 5 minutes later, I have probably 2 days worth of like administrative stuff taken care of. Now I can focus my time on, okay, are those fallbacks right? Or do I need to tweak them slightly? Can I make this explanation a little easier for the business to understand as to why the fallback is there or not there? So I see it as a really, for those sort of things, very, very powerful. Spin up a tool to do this or that, pretty easily. We're probably like leaning a little more into it than people who are just kind of dabbling at this point. But I think it's a real enabler for in-house teams. You are always strapped for time. You're always strapped for resources. The budgeting process, just like any other group, you have to justify and, all the tools that you have and all the headcount that you have, all the travel spend, all the education spend. There's a whole laundry list that goes into the budget as you're doing the budgeting every year. And headcount's expensive and attorneys are expensive. So how can you maximize their impact? And one of the ways is like get yourself a good legal ops, person, and get yourself some great tools for automating workflows and everything. And then every new attorney, every new person in the team you add is just like a 10x compared to if they didn't have those tools and you just had to throw bodies at it. I think there's been a shift, and that shift has happened in the past 10 years. When I was at Amazon initially, and they're very efficient. They're very focused on, process improvement and everything. But even when I first started, as 2008, the answer was I got swamped and I'm not able to keep up with all the contracts, and some of them are slipping through the cracks, and therefore I need another person. But it wasn't like you weren't tracking every single contract. You weren't tracking how much time. You didn't have metrics or anything like that. It was just a finger to the wind sort of thing. And it was all through another attorney at it. And it sort of morphed over time. Well, does it really need an attorney? Maybe it could be a contract manager. Maybe our legal assistant or this person could do it. Maybe it doesn't even need to be done. And so that's been a progression over like 10 years to where legal ops is now really like a focus of all teams. How do we operationalize this? How do we add process to it? How do we streamline it before we add more headcount for legal? And I think legal AI is another, extension of that. How do we now add this to it to do the same sort of thing? Make it so that the work that people on the team are doing is highly impactful and really does need that big brain.
So what's the calculus behind tinkering with developing something like that in-house as opposed to going and buying an out-of-the-box solution?
I think that one's a hard one to build yourself. Like I said, I played with and dabbled with building my own just to see, if I could more than anything. And just like, hey, could I make an automated one for home to do that sort of stuff for me in my personal life? I think those, because you're integrating with all the other systems in your organization, your Gmail, your Outlook, your Slack, your Salesforce and all that, that's a heavy lift for somebody to go and build that. And it's sort of like build or buy. Like you don't build something that you could buy off the shelf and it's got all the SOC 2 compliance and all of that. That's something you buy because it just doesn't make sense to build it and then maintain it over time and have all those integrations. I think one of the things that I see is really powerful though for using like Claude codes and things like that is if I have a very unique to us sort of thing, I can build a tool that operates completely within our environment. That's completely, data doesn't go anywhere else. It's all, again, hosted in AWS or something. Then I could build a one-off tool for us that I couldn't get from anyone else, or a feature that I couldn't get from anyone else. And I think that's where, or just I have this one need to do this thing and I can do a project really quickly if I involve AI in some way. That's a good use of it. I think it's, and there's, some of that's coming together kind of in open source GitHub repos. And maybe at some point you'll have a community that picks up a set of these tools, builds them out and builds them into production level. And, and then you can go and pick, if you're a small law firm, or if you're a legal team, say, look, this is all built really well. It's documented. I can look at the code. I can look at the documentation. I can actually put the different pieces together and have a working solution for me that my IT team is okay with. Um, and I think that may be in the future.
I'm not a technical person, so I put it in layman's terms, but I have this fantasy of an app store where you almost sort of like, crowdsourcing development of legal solutions that can then be purchased, plug and play. Is there like a technical breakthrough or waiting for that to occur? I, as a lawyer, would be like, okay, I have too many NDAs to deal with. I want to quickly find an NDA tool. You go to
Yeah.
some platform, you quickly search for NDA tools, you see reviews, you click, you download, bam, you get to use it, and you have all the security, you have all the integration you expect. Like,
Yeah.
is that just too pie in the sky, or what are you
No,
waiting
I,
for that
I
to
don't think
happen?
it is. I think among that group of people who are really thinking about this, there's a big discussion about standards, right? And setting those, because, I code something and I have preferences, or I'm building a certain way, I'm using Python backend, TypeScript front end, React Native, whatever it might be. Am I using Fast API? Am I building for Docker container? Like, I think if once you start to standardize, like, okay, we're going to, like, if there's this repository, there's this app store, all of these things are compatible. They're all built with the same structure. They can work together. They handle data the same way. They protect it the same ways. Their encryption works together because there's a standard that everyone's sort of adopted. And I think if you can adopt some basic standards for how things in that repository app store work together, then I think you can get there. So I think there's just some work to do in setting the frameworks for it.
So that's the open source route. Is there
Yeah.
a walled garden route from
Oh
your
yeah.
standpoint? Kind of like the Apple ecosystem route, where as opposed to being open source, it's really a closed ecosystem and completely controlled. Is that a path forward as well?
Yeah. My wife is a therapist, so her answer to that question would be, why not both? Or is there a third option? Which is great. It does make me think a lot more. I think there could be, in the software world, there's certainly like a commercial open source route. Like, you could see people. In fact, I've done this with one of the things I build. I built a law school education app to help people learn how to study for law school tests or study for bar tests. And I put it out on the Apple App Store. It's got fun graphics. It's gamified. It's all this. And I have about, 5 or 6 users who pay $10 a month. And it makes me happy that some people are finding value with it and using it on an ongoing basis. I would like it to be more, not for the money, just, to add value to the community and give people a tool. So I open sourced it as well. So, if you want to build your own, you want to just download the open source code, compile it and run it yourself outside of the App Store, you can do that for free. And it's built the same way that it had to be built to get through Apple's process. You could also pull the code and you could make a version for Berkeley law with your, logos and all this, and with specific backend knowledge database that has the Berkeley materials, right, for the classes and everything. And that then it generates questions and grades them and everything based upon a rubric from there. So that could be a model that, like, people release commercial, but they also release an open source tool, and maybe they make it, they put some parameters in the licensing that if you're a firm under this size or you're a solo or whatever, you can use it for free, right? And so they have the two path. There could be also just like the kind of separate app store for these kind of things. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few years. And I think some of it, though, is like figuring out what the frameworks are for that. So people are building in ways that are compatible.
Yeah. I mean, in another context, these standards sometimes are developed by the incumbents, the big incumbents that merge in the space.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about the history of these industries to say whether or not it happens the other way, where
Yeah.
organically you have very atomized market and somehow those atomized parts come together to create a standard that then
Yeah.
leads to something like consolidated. I don't know if that's a realistic hope,
Yeah.
but I would love to see something that's more plug and play as opposed to this option of looking at 10,000 vendors with 10,000 products.
Yeah.
Impossible to figure out what they offer. It's impossible to compare them.
Yeah.
Incredibly long process to try to figure it all out, to vet them. then go through your internal procurement process, whether it's law firm, whether it's legal department or corporate. It's just not conducive in our industry to doing quick deployment of technology. And so I think
Yeah.
it's a huge barrier.
I think that's true, and I think that's why, despite, whether we're in a bubble or whatever, I think that the brand name and the use by a lot of other people give people comfort to sign on and use a particular product. It may cost more than you necessarily should have to pay. Like other people might be cheaper, less expensive, but we gravitate towards those name brands, and they get traction and they become like kind of de facto standards to some degree. I wrote my last paper. You had to do 2 papers in law school to graduate. One of them like a 60 plus page or whatever. And mine was on how standards act in some ways as de facto rules of law. They really sort of set like what you can and can't do artificially. And, those who control the standards and set the standards, it's sort of quasi-governmental control over getting about internet standards and how, data transfer protocols, those can be set by organizations or companies that benefit them and give lock-in, right? So I'm always leery of some big players setting some standard that then locks them in. But at the same time, because people have, there's so much exhaustion at so many things out there and tools and everything, it can be the great place. Probably the best place to start is with a brand name, is with something that like, has some traction. Look, when we evaluated CLM solutions, part of our evaluation was where is the company in its stage of financing? How long have they been around? We're buying into a solution that has to be integrated deeply into our products, and it'd be horrible. Like, General Counsel, you don't want to have to like, sell somebody, like get the budget for something, integrate it, and then the next year they're gone. So there is some value in doing, going with a name that has some, an ironclad or whoever it might be, who's been around for some time, because you have some certainty. Now they may cost a lot more and also be lagging in technology behind newer solutions that are better, but you're not going to have to a year later maybe switch it out. So, you may want to switch it out for other reasons, but you may not, you don't want to have to switch it out because they're gone and it's no longer supported. And now your IT team's upset at you because now they have to go through an integration process on your behalf again. So that's one of the things that, general counselors are thinking about technology are thinking. And sometimes they do go with like the solution, but around the edges, once you have those basic things, then, can you use these tools like Claude Code or whatever to cut more time out, to streamline other things that there's no commercial product for? Yes, I think you can. And I think they can be really powerful. So, again, we're like in the Wild West. It's a good time to be like, I was at dinner last night with some folks, and that was kind of the theme, is like, this is an amazing time to be alive. I feel like the past 2 years, I have learned at a much faster rate. I love learning new things, and it just feels like just a cornucopia for those of us who want to learn new things and try new things. There's a lot of new things to do and try right now. So,
Yeah, let me wrap us up with one comment, which is
yeah,
on the point about being a fragmented space and the challenges that creates for users. I'm really encouraging to hear from this conversation at least 2 alternatives to consolidation, because I think consolidation is sort of the almost default assumption in these
yeah,
markets that, okay, well, everyone's going to roll up into a few and then that'll be easier for users. But of course, that comes with downsides. So it's really encouraging to hear you mention 2 alternatives. One is the standard setting. It's
yeah,
really interesting. I really want to think about that more. And the other is to think about the build
yeah,
option, the build versus buy. That build is really an alternative as well. I hadn't thought about that as well. So
yeah,
appreciate that perspective.
yeah, yeah. I think you're, there's costs that come along with the build, but I think the place where it's really powerful is when it's building a fast, quick tool just for you that saves you. It took me 5 minutes with Claude Code to do that, saved me 2 days. Now, I wasn't going to go find a tool out there. There's no that I could find a playbook generator that I wouldn't have to get like a whole other product and have it just be a feature of a product to get access to. And so that's a situation where being able to like just quickly build something to do a particular task just saved me a whole lot of time. And that can be very powerful. So you might still have some of those big products that you bring on board, but then you've got this way to kind of add incremental savings and improvements for you. So yeah, it's gonna be fun to see how this shapes out.
And a full spectrum of tools and solutions available to lawyers, because I think when you're in this sort of LinkedIn bubble, there's a tendency to see a lot of extreme positions. Like it's
Yeah,
all going to be built, it's all going to be consolidated.
yeah,
And really, the reality always is that every market emerges with a lot of different options. And I'm
yeah,
sure that will be the case here as well.
yeah. You can cut off the recording if you want to, but I think that there's two extremes too, in the people who use vibe code as a derisive term. But we do,
That's a good example. Yeah.
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 But the
There's
thing
two
is,
camps. Is vibe coding a dirty word, or is it,
right, and
is it a cool word?
right, and for me, I think sometimes it's the gatekeeping, right? And we're not as attorneys, we're guilty of it too, right? There's a lot of people who are like, "Oh, you shouldn't be using these tools for legal advice." Well, like, what if somebody doesn't have access to justice? What if people don't have a way to talk to a lawyer? What if a lawyer talks, it costs $500 and the matter's not even worth, a couple $100? There's value in giving people access to these things, but we like to gatekeep as well because we like to make it like this mysterious black box thing that only we can do. And if you touch it, you might get shocked to death. And I think, and that's certainly true where somebody is not confident in their own skills and is trying to sell based on that fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The same happens, with engineering teams who are like, I used to have a great business, building websites for attorneys for $100,000 a pop, and that was a great business. And now they can just spin up Claude Code and build their own website. Oh, now I'm going to say vibe coding is bad. Your back end scrappy, right? And maybe that's true with the website, but it's not true for everything. But it is a way to kind of gatekeep and try to frighten people off of trying it, which I think is bad on both that side as well as on the legal side. Like, let people get a first pass of understanding their rights and stuff. If they don't have any other way to get it, that's better than nothing. And I think with coding, it's better than nothing. It's also really good. Why don't you have your attorneys actually understand this stuff and build with it? Even if they don't ever put it into production, there's a lot of learning and value in that.
I have said this before and I'll say it again. To me, it is a perfectly rational act to use ChatGPT for legal advice in some contexts. For some people, for some uses. Just the
Yeah.
way that I use it for accounting questions, I use it for medical questions. Who am I to say that the law is somehow the point at which you
Yeah.
have to stop? To
It's
me, it's
not, yeah.
obvious.
Yeah. It's not magical. What we do is not, it's certainly not rocket science, and
You don't do you don't make a decision on what surgery to get from ChatGPT, and you
no,
don't bet the company litigation with ChatGPT either, right? But there's use cases well short of that these tools are useful
absolutely.
for. I
Absolutely.
completely
Yeah.
agree with you.
Same with
So
coding too, right? Yeah.
that's a great point.
Yeah.
Kevin, thank you so much
Yeah.
for coming on the podcast. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you coming on.
Great to talk to you.